John Wilkes Booth, a short biography, written and read by Troy Cowan. John Wilkes Booth's father was a brilliant actor named Junius Booth. Junius had a girlfriend named Mary Ann Holmes, and she became John's mother. John was the 9th of 10 children. When John Wilkes Booth was a boy, he heard news accounts of the radical Republicans crossing over into the slave states to set fire to the slave owners' crops and kill their cattle. Sometimes they would kill the slave owner. The young John Wilkes Booth was greatly upset over their acts of terror. John's sympathy was with the Southerners that had their lives destroyed by these terrorists. In his late teens, John Wilkes Booth decided to become an actor. He didn't take his acting seriously and frequently forgot his lines. He became known as an actor with little promise. To save his family's reputation, John decided to swap his middle and last name. He became John B. Wilkes. As the years passed, John Wilkes began to master his craft, and he became a leading man. One day, the young actor met a lovely lady 12 years older than he was. Booth introduced himself as John Wilkes, and she gave her name as Lola Alexander. Lola found it amusing that she knew two people with the same name, and told John B. Wilkes about John Byron Wilkes. When John Wilkes Booth was on tour and passing through Terre Haute, Indiana, sometimes Lola would make arrangements for Booth to stay in the home of John Byron Wilkes. During the war, the South was in desperate need of medicine. John Wilkes made a fortune smuggling opiates for pain and quinine to reduce fever. His contact was General Stonewall Jackson. One day, Stonewall Jackson told Jefferson Davis of the daring exploits Booth was making for the South. Weeks later, Jefferson Davis arranged for a secret meeting with Booth. Davis offered Booth $100,000 in gold to capture Abraham Lincoln and exchange him for the prisoners of war held by the North. Booth accepted. Booth couldn't deposit the gold in any bank without causing suspicion, so he bought a secluded farm in the Shenandoah Valley to hide his money. Booth made several attempts to kidnap Lincoln, but they all failed. On Friday, April 14, 1865, the day of Lincoln's assassination, Booth was participating in a kidnapping plan directed by the Knights of the Golden Circle. Also on that Friday, there was a conspiracy to kill Lincoln that Booth knew nothing about. Edwin Stanton had an assassination plan of his own. He was the Secretary of War, and he wanted to confiscate much of the South's wealth for himself. Lincoln was always interfering with his plans, and Lincoln needed to be killed. Before Lincoln could be killed, Abraham had to fall into Stanton's trap. Ford's Theater was being prepared for Lincoln's assassination, and Lincoln had to be enticed into going to the theater that night. Stanton had one of his agents put in an announcement in the morning paper saying that Lincoln would attend the play at Ford's Theater, and everyone was excited about seeing him there. That morning, Lincoln had no plans to attend the theater. Then Abraham read in the morning paper that the people were expecting him. He and Mary believed that President Lincoln could not disappoint the public, and they decided to attend. The trap was set. Ned Spangler was a carpenter at Ford's Theater and a known Lincoln hater. He was recruited into Stanton's plan to help with the assassination. At 11:30 on the morning of the assassination, Ned Spangler installed a brace on the hallway door leading to the president's box. This brace would prevent people from entering the hallway after the shot was fired. Stanton selected a Confederate prisoner named James William Boyd as the assassin, and released him from prison on the condition that he join them. Stanton's plan was a good one. At the theater, after Lincoln's useless guard was lured away from his post by the promise of strong drink, Boyd was to enter the hallway leading to the president's box and put the brace on the door, keeping others out. Boyd would wait outside the president's box until Spangler turned out the house lights. As the gas lights dimmed and were about to go out, Boyd would enter the box and put a bullet in the president's head. In the darkness, Boyd would then climb over the railing and drop down to the stage. He would calmly mingle in with the crowd and walk out of the theater with all the others. There was a flaw in Stanton's plan. Boyd could see no advantage to himself to kill the president. All Boyd wanted was to be out of prison. On Friday he left Washington. Stanton had made all the preparations for Lincoln's killing and had no assassin. Unknown to Stanton, the Knights of the Golden Circle were planning to kidnap Lincoln, Johnson, and Seward. The KGC had 13 men dressed in Union uniforms practicing their kidnapping plan in Maryland. John Wilkes Booth was the KGC's coordinator. Booth's physical presence would not be needed when the actual kidnapping was taking place. His job was to learn where the President, Vice President, and Secretary of State were and inform the kidnappers in Maryland. On Friday morning, Booth knew where Johnson and Seward could be found, but had no idea where Lincoln was or would be. Because of this, there was no kidnapping plan for that day. At the same time, Ned Spangler was installing the brace on the hallway door leading to the president's box. Booth was sitting on the steps at the theater, reading his mail. One letter was from Lola Alexander. Lola wrote, "You seem to forget that he paid with his life for what he believed was good and necessary. When you have served your cause with half the dedication and loyalty he showed, then perhaps you may have earned the right to criticize, but I doubt that this will happen." This visibly upset Booth. As Booth was reading his mail, Mr. Ford walked up to him and greeted him. He told Booth that Lincoln would be attending the theater that night. Booth realized what he must do. Booth had to go to Maryland to notify the men that the plan to kidnap Lincoln was on for tonight. While Booth was in Maryland, Lieutenant Dana heard rumors of Lincoln's assassination and ordered the bridges closed to everyone except those presenting a strong need to pass or having the password. The 13 KGC men were dressed in Union uniforms and had no problem crossing the bridge. When Booth was stopped by the guard at the bridge and asked why he needed to pass, he stammered. The guard arrested him and put him in the guardhouse. Booth was detained for 4 hours. When he was released, Booth headed for the tavern where his men were waiting. He discovered that half of his men had gotten themselves drunk. Booth reluctantly called off the kidnapping. Vice President Andrew Johnson was an informant providing Booth with information on Lincoln's whereabouts. After Booth called off the KGC's kidnapping plan, he went to see Johnson to tell him that he was returning to acting and not to contact him any longer. Johnson questioned Booth's determination and dedication. Then Johnson proposed that he kill Lincoln. Johnson offered Booth a pardon if caught and gave Booth the password to get over the Navy Yard Bridge. Booth was still smarting from Lola's letter questioning his loyalty and dedication. In addition, Booth had another reason to prove his commitment to the cause. Archbishop Spalding once told Booth that Lincoln was an apostate and deserved death. Booth made his decision and told Johnson that he would kill Lincoln tonight. Booth also had to inform the KGC's leadership that their kidnapping plan was off, and he was going to kill Lincoln. The KGC offered their assistance if Booth would also kill Johnson and Seward. Again, Booth agreed. But he did not want Johnson killed. Booth would give the assignment to kill Johnson to a man he knew would not do it. Ned Spangler had prepared the theater for Lincoln's assassination, but he was not told who the assassin was. That afternoon, when Booth arrived at the theater, Booth told his good friend and fellow Lincoln hater that he was going to assassinate Lincoln tonight and needed his help. Spangler then told Booth of the brace he had made for the hallway door and his other preparations. Booth was encouraged by this news and believed Johnson had done a good job of preparation, even though Johnson had nothing to do with it. At 10:15, Booth was successful in shooting Lincoln and made his escape. Booth knew nothing of Stanton's plan to assassinate Lincoln, but Boyd was thoroughly involved. Boyd needed to be found and killed. When Colonel Conger learned that Boyd was the man in the Garrett barn, Conger shot Boyd. Conger then found a dupe named Boston Corbett to receive the credit for the killing. While Boyd was dying at the Garrett farm, Booth was making his way to his secluded farm. At the farm, his wife was waiting for him. Isola nursed him back to health. About a year later, Booth went to California, and he would send for Isola later. A dead man couldn't apply for a passport, but John Byron Wilkes could. Using the name John Byron Wilkes, Booth applied for a British passport and got it. When Isola arrived in San Francisco, they left for India. Life in India didn't agree with Isola, and she asked John to take her home. Booth made arrangements for their return to San Francisco. Eventually, Isola returned to the East Coast, and Booth wound up in Texas. One of the aliases he used was John St. Helens, and another was William J. Ryan. One day, a man exclaimed that Ryan looked just like John Wilkes Booth. Being recognized severely shocked him. Booth decided to return to India. In India, Booth found himself alone in a strange country, and after a short time he decided to return to the United States. Booth still had investments in America that he couldn't touch. Before he left India, he thought of a way to free up those assets. He would write a will using the name John Byron Wilkes and claim that he was the owner of the assets of John B. Wilkes. After everything was ready, Booth let his alias John Byron Wilkes die, and he returned to the United States. The will eventually got into the hands of Ulysses S. Grant, who was now a half-owner in an investment firm that held the assets of John B. Wilkes. Grant ordered an investigation to determine if John Byron Wilkes was the legitimate owner of the assets they were holding for John B. Wilkes. Grant hired Lew Wallace, an ex-general and now an attorney, to head the investigation. While the investigation was in progress, Grant's investment firm went bankrupt. All the assets held at the firm were transferred to other investment firms for safekeeping. When the results of the investigation did come in, it was determined that John Byron Wilkes was the owner of the assets under the name of John B. Wilkes. Unfortunately, Grant was seriously ill. He died before the results were known. The executor of the will was living in India, and it took him 10 years to get the mess straightened out. In 1896, when the will was finally implemented, Booth's wife and daughter were dead. Both women died believing Booth was also dead. Isola believed Booth died in 1869, and Ogarita was told that John Wilkes Booth died at the Garrett Farm in 1865. But John Wilkes Booth was not dead. He was alive and well. After Booth left India, he returned to Texas and eventually wound up in Oklahoma. At the time of his death, he was using the name David E. George. John Wilkes Booth died in 1903.